The world watched in shock as President Donald Trump fired the first shot in a global trade war. With a swift stroke of his pen, he imposed steep tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, sending waves of uncertainty through international markets. But what happened next was even more dramatic. America's closest allies, Canada and the European Union, weren't about to take it lying down. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood before reporters, his usual calm demeanor edged with frustration. He called the tariffs unacceptable and an attack on Canadian workers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European leaders met in hurried discussions, strategizing their next move. If Trump thought they would simply accept these trade barriers, he was mistaken. Within days, both Canada and the EU announced their own countermeasures, targeting American exports with billions of dollars in retaliatory tariffs. Bourbon, Harley-Davidsons, and even orange juice, nothing was off the table. As tensions escalated, businesses and workers found themselves caught in the middle. A Canadian steelworker who had spent decades in the industry worried about his job. "If the US doesn't want our steel, where does that leave us?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. In Kentucky, a bourbon distiller braced for the impact of European tariffs, knowing that his sales overseas could plummet. These weren't just political games. Real people, real livelihoods were on the line. Meanwhile, President Trump remained defiant. "We're going to bring jobs back to America," he insisted at a rally, drawing cheers from supporters. His administration argued that the tariffs were necessary to protect U.S. industries from unfair competition. But was this really about jobs, or was it a high-stakes power play on the world stage? As world leaders traded sharp words and new tariffs loomed, one question remained: how far would this trade war go? Would Canada and the EU back down, or was this just the beginning of an even bigger economic showdown? Stay with us as we break down the high-stakes battle unfolding between global superpowers, because this fight isn't just about trade. It's about alliances, power, and the future of the world economy. And as the tension rises, one thing is clear: no one is walking away from this fight unscathed. For decades, Canada and the European Union had been among America's closest allies, bound by trade deals, shared values, and economic cooperation. But suddenly, those relationships were being tested like never before. The tariffs weren't just about steel and aluminum. They sent a message. The United States, under Trump's leadership, was putting America first, even at the cost of long-standing friendships. In Brussels, EU officials scrambled to respond. They had seen Trump's unpredictable moves before, but this was different. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker delivered a blunt warning: "We can also do stupid." And with that, Europe made its move. Tariffs were announced on iconic American products, carefully chosen to hit industries in key political states. Bourbon from Kentucky, motorcycles from Wisconsin, jeans from California. These weren't random choices. They were aimed at applying maximum pressure on Trump's base, forcing him to reconsider his aggressive trade policies. Meanwhile, in Canada, the response was just as fierce. Prime Minister Trudeau, normally diplomatic in his approach, didn't hold back. "We will not be pushed around," he declared, standing before a group of steelworkers. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, including ketchup, maple syrup, and even American-made steel, turning Trump's strategy back on itself. For a country that had always enjoyed a close economic partnership with the U.S., this was uncharted territory. But while world leaders traded threats, ordinary workers were left in limbo. At a steel plant in Ontario, a father of 3 worried about his future. "If these tariffs stay in place, I don't know how long my job will last," he admitted. In the US, soybean farmers were growing anxious as other nations considered their own countermeasures. China, watching from the sidelines, saw an opportunity. If America's allies were breaking ties, Beijing was ready to step in and strengthen its own trade relationships. Back in Washington, Trump remained confident. At a press conference, he dismissed concerns over retaliation. Other countries have been taking advantage of us for years, he insisted. We're just leveling the playing field. His supporters cheered, convinced that tough trade policies were long overdue. But behind the scenes, some of his closest advisors worried that America might have underestimated the backlash. Would the pressure from allies force Trump to reconsider? Or was the world on the brink of an all-out trade war? As the days passed, tensions only grew. One thing was clear: this fight was far from over. As the trade war escalated, the fallout spread beyond politicians and policymakers. It was hitting businesses, workers, and entire industries in ways no one had fully predicted. Across North America and Europe, companies were scrambling to adjust. Some were stockpiling raw materials, unsure if supply chains would be disrupted. Others were already seeing the effects as costs surged and foreign buyers pulled out of deals. In the American Midwest, a small manufacturing company that relied on Canadian steel faced a tough decision. "We can't absorb these extra costs forever," the owner admitted. Raising prices could drive away customers, but taking the hit could mean layoffs. In retaliation, Canadian businesses also started looking elsewhere, cutting deals with European and Asian suppliers. A quiet but steady shift was happening, one that could permanently alter trade relationships. Meanwhile, in Europe, the impact was just as real. A German auto executive voiced frustration, saying, "If this continues, American cars will become too expensive for European buyers, and they'll have no choice but to source parts from other markets." The EU's counter-tariffs were designed to pressure US industries, but they also risked sparking an economic standoff with no clear end. Farmers in the US were growing increasingly anxious. As global markets adjusted, exports of soybeans, pork, and dairy products faced new hurdles. Some shipments were delayed, others cancelled altogether. A farmer in Iowa, already struggling with thin profit margins, watched as prices dipped. "We're caught in the middle of a political fight," he said, "and the people making these decisions aren't the ones paying the price." At the same time, the trade dispute wasn't just about numbers and policies, it was reshaping global alliances. Canada and the EU, historically aligned with the US, were now strengthening ties with other trading partners. At a summit in Ottawa, Trudeau and EU leaders discussed deepening economic cooperation, signaling that if the US was going to play hardball, they would find new ways to move forward without it. Back in Washington, Trump doubled down. His advisors presented reports showing that tariffs were beginning to hurt American businesses, but he remained firm. "We're winning," he told reporters, brushing off concerns. But behind closed doors, tensions were rising within his own administration. Some officials worried that pushing allies too far could backfire. Would they cave under pressure, or would they find a way to fight back even harder? With billions at stake and no clear resolution in sight, the world was watching. No one knew exactly how this would end, but everyone knew the next move could change everything. As weeks turned into months, the tension between the US, Canada, and the European Union reached a breaking point. What had started as a bold trade move by President Trump had now spiraled into a global standoff, with each side refusing to back down. The tariffs were no longer just policy decisions. They were political statements, symbols of power and defiance, and the consequences were growing more severe by the day. At a bustling port in Ontario, stacks of unsold steel and aluminum sat untouched, waiting for buyers who might never come. Workers who had once felt secure in their jobs were now facing layoffs. "This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This is our lives," one factory worker said, frustration in his voice. Across the border, American farmers watched helplessly as their crops sat in silos, waiting for markets that had suddenly closed. China, once a major buyer of US soybeans, had shifted its orders to Brazil, leaving American farmers scrambling to find new buyers. In Brussels, European leaders gathered for an emergency summit, the mood tense and uncertain. The EU had already imposed billions in counter-tariffs, but now there were whispers of a stronger response, one that could hit major US industries even harder. "We didn't start this. One European diplomat said behind closed doors, "But we will finish it if we must." The possibility of a full-blown trade war no longer seemed like a distant threat. It was becoming reality. Meanwhile, in Washington, Trump's advisors were locked in heated debates. Some warned that the tariffs were backfiring, hurting the very industries they were meant to protect. Others insisted that this was just the painful first step toward a stronger American economy. Trump himself remained unwavering, blasting Canada and the EU for their unfair trade practices. At a rally, he doubled down, telling a cheering crowd, "They need us more than we need them. They'll come back to the table on our terms." The world watched as high-level negotiations were arranged. In Ottawa and Brussels, officials prepared their demands. They had the leverage now, and they knew it. The US wanted a new deal, but it wouldn't come without concessions. When the talks began, Canada and the EU made one thing clear: the old trade relationships couldn't simply go back to the way they were. If the US wanted to be part of global trade, it would have to recognize that other nations had alternatives now. The balance of power had shifted. For Trump, this was a delicate moment. He couldn't afford to look weak, but he also couldn't ignore the growing political and economic pressure. The final deal reflected that tension. Tariffs were rolled back, but not entirely. Canada and the EU secured stronger protections for their industries, ensuring they wouldn't be caught off guard again. And while Trump claimed victory in public, calling it the greatest trade deal in history, insiders knew the truth. America had been forced to adjust. But just when it seemed like the dust was settling, an unexpected twist sent shockwaves through global markets. China, which had been watching the trade war unfold from the sidelines, made its own bold move. It announced a massive trade agreement with several key European nations, further solidifying its role as a dominant player in global commerce. Suddenly, the US wasn't just facing pressure from its allies, it was at risk of being left behind in an even larger economic shift. The trade war had ended, but its effects would last for years. The world had changed, and the US now had to decide how to navigate a new global order, one where power was no longer concentrated in Washington alone. As the dust settled, the world took stock of what had changed. The trade war had pushed allies apart, tested long-standing relationships, and reshaped global commerce in ways no one had fully anticipated. While the US, Canada, and the European Union had managed to negotiate a way forward, the damage had already been done. Supply chains had shifted, new trade partnerships had been formed, and businesses had learned a hard lesson. Economic stability was no longer guaranteed. For American industries, the outcome was mixed. Some manufacturers saw short-term benefits from the tariffs, but others struggled with rising costs and lost markets. Farmers, once hopeful that the trade war would bring them better deals, were left picking up the pieces from disrupted exports. Many had to seek out new buyers, adjust their operations, or even consider leaving the industry altogether. "We just want certainty," one farmer in Iowa said. "We can't keep living like this, waiting for the next policy change to decide if we sink or swim." In Canada and Europe, leaders framed the resolution as a win for cooperation and diplomacy. But behind the scenes, there was a quiet understanding. This trade war had exposed vulnerabilities. No country, no matter how strong, could afford to depend too heavily on one partner. That's why new trade agreements with other global powers, including China, had been set in motion. The world economy had begun to shift in a way that couldn't be undone. And in Washington, Trump continued to insist that his tough stance had forced other nations to respect America's power. His supporters cheered, but among businesses and lawmakers, there was a growing realization that the world was moving on. With or without the US, the trade war may have ended, but its ripple effects would last for years. In the end, this wasn't just a battle over tariffs. It was a lesson in how fragile global trade could be, how quickly alliances could be tested, and how no country, not even the most powerful, could stand alone forever. The real question now was whether the US had learned that lesson, or if history would repeat itself once again.